Good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest IP webinar, which has the title Off to the Races, Horse Racing's Role in US Gaming Expansion. Now, today's session is sponsored by BetMakers, which is one of the businesses that is poised to play a massive role as the racetracks work to ramp up their involvement in an evolving market. And we have BetMakers Chief Operating Officer Jake Henson, who's going to take over shortly to moderate the discussion, for which we've got a bit of a who's who of leading racetracks across the US participating. Now, as my colleague Cole Rush wrote in a feature published ahead of this session, horse race betting is one of the oldest and most established forms of gambling in the US. However, it's increasingly fighting for players' attention amid an expanding range of other legal products. And what we're really trying to do with this session is give the operators an opportunity to explain how they're planning to ensure racing remains a key component of this market going forward. Now, just before I hand over to Jake and the panel, a few housekeeping notes. So this session will be recorded and will then be available to listen again on demand and to share. And we'll also be taking questions. So if there's something you'd like to ask, please put it in the GoToWebinar interface. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll go through as many as we can after the discussion. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Jake and our excellent panel. So Jake, over to you, mate.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. And hello to everyone who's tuning in from around the world. As mentioned, my name is Jake Henson, the Chief Operating Officer for the BetMakers Technology Group. BetMakers is a racing technology company that services racetracks, rights holders and wagering operators around the world through our software and our hardware solutions. As Robin touched on, joined by an esteemed panel today of racing industry experts, specifically racetracks in the US, to discuss some macro industry issues and more specifically drill down into the role racing can play in the growth of that regulated wagering within the United States market. Before I dive into the questions, just a brief introduction on our panelists. We have Dennis Drazen, the Chairman and CEO of Derby Development, the operator of Monmouth Park Racetrack in New Jersey. Dennis played an instrumental role in the repeal of PASPA in the USA and also recently joined the board of Australian-based wagering operator PlayUp to assist in their US expansion. We have Ed Cummins here as well, Managing Director of Wibis Holdings, a business that includes the Cal Expo Harness Racetrack and the ADW business Watch and Wager. Prior to that, Ed worked at the UK Tote. And we also have John Walsh, Assistant GM of the Hawthorne Racecourse in Chicago. Hawthorne have recently partnered with wagering operator PointsBet to roll out a premium retail sportsbook product at the Illinois venues. So without any further ado, we'll bounce into some questions and we'll start with Ed. And Ed, given your global experience, it would be great to get a bit of a macro view from you on the current state of the racing wagering landscape within the USA, just to give a bit of a background for the listeners before we move on to some of the forward-looking questions. You might be on mute still, Ed. Looks like he's still on mute. Yep, there you go.
Muted. Yeah, okay. Hi, Jake. Great to see you. Ed Cummings here from California. Bit early in the morning, but it's another beautiful day here. I think this is going to be a very good webinar. So just to answer your questions, I actually think that US racing is in quite a good shape. A lot of people may disagree with us, but we've had tremendous success on the thoroughbred side with Magic Guide and Mystic Guide winning the Dubai World Cup, which was quite amazing, taking back 5 million from Arabia back to the US. We believe that that generally the business is in reasonably good shape. I have to congratulate all the industry on the way they've behaved during COVID. Obviously, we all want crowds back at the racetracks, including our own racetrack at Cal Expo in California. But obviously, we've got to play by the rules, and I think everyone has performed extremely well. My final point is racing is a huge employer in the US, probably the second biggest employer in any sporting events in the US after probably American football. We do have some welfare people looking at our welfare issues. I think racing has made a huge improvement in welfare over the last couple of years, and what's not to like, really? We're just coming up to the huge Keeneland event, which starts Friday. Some superb racing there, and then obviously the Triple Crown coming up shortly after that. So I'm very excited about US racing and the opportunities that we've got with sports gaming.
Sure, yeah, and obviously the timing is good. We are coming into racing season in that part of the world, and this is a good segue for Dennis and John just to touch on what they believe to be some of the low-hanging fruit within the industry from a wagering perspective that the industry can work on to obviously grow the pie, but also get the product in front of some new eyes for the first time. So we'll start with you, Dennis.
So I think that one of the things we have to embrace, and it requires a new way of thinking, is this fixed odds concept. You know, it's a proven success story in other parts of the world, and the US is lagging behind in terms of being willing to innovate. So I think that one thing that everybody needs to do is take a serious look at fixed odds, try and enable it in your state, whether that requires legislation or regulatory changes, or simply just, you know, initiating the response to it. But I think that right now, when we look at racing has to grow. So racing in terms of worldwide gambling, you know, is seen by a limited number of eyes compared to the rest of the gaming world. And I think the vision 5 years down the road, at least that I have and others share, is that 5 years from now, you'll probably have every type of wager that you can make in the world being offered on an app. And there will be a number of apps competing for the business. But right now, our racing business, you know, is limited to the eyes that see it now, whereas the sports gaming business in general probably has 20 times greater multiples of eyes on the product. And if you have the ability to bet on everything that's out there, even a small percentage of the overall gaming interests in the world is going to represent a significant increase for horse racing. So I think the mentality right now is that in the US, there's not a common belief as to the right way to do this, the right pricing for it, you know, but I think it's coming and it's here to stay, and we have to start taking baby steps to enable it. New Jersey has become a leader in this space, and we intend to continue to try and grow our business in that fashion.
And John, if you're there, I'll get you to chime in on that point as well.
I agree with Dennis. I think fixed odds is probably a big part of the future of racing. Especially when you look at Australia, the way things work there, where they're kind of in a downhill slide, kind of like all of us in racing, and then fixed odds kind of, you know, put things up because people, when they want to bet on something, they want to bet at the price that they're betting at right now. You know, that's really the biggest thing. I also think that we do have to price it correctly because there are purses that have to be paid for, and the people offering the races have to get something out of it. But baby steps is a good way of putting it. We need to start somewhere and then work on where we go from there. Our partner PointsBet is very active in the fixed odds in Australia, and they're interested in bringing it here to the U.S. as well as BetMakers is. And I think in the long run, I think all of the tracks are. They're some of them are just worried they're not going to get what they think their fair share is. So when you see sports betting, people don't have to watch it. They can just bet on whatever game's on. But when it is on TV, it does add a lot more volume to that wager. Ping pong's one thing, but the NCAA March Madness, it's on all the channels, is something else. So Naira Bets, I guess, partnered with Fox, and they're going to have a lot more content on the Fox FS1 and FS2 channels. And I think that's what us in the racing industry have to do, is get with people who have places to put our content and get on it, because that's the only way you're going to grow. So thanks.
Sure. And Ed, if you had any points to add to that, please do now.
I agree. I agree with several of the points, particularly John's. I think it's all about the price. I think that's incredibly important in our industry, and the price is a big concern. I think we're going to come back to that in some of the other questions in the webinar. But let's face it, the prize money in the US, the purse money is extremely good, and you only have to look at the UK model, which, as you can tell from my accent, is where I was from originally. The prize money is derisory because there's less purses, less money going back into the sport because of fixed odds and Betfair and other forms of wagering. So there's got to be a balance, but I think we're going to be talking about that in the next few questions.
Sure, yeah. So the question I had for John and Dennis, who now both, I guess, have exposure to the sports betting growth in the United States through various partnerships. I'd like to know what's been observed within the market about how these fixed odds sports betting operators have been able to integrate racing into their offering. And I guess the feedback you've had from them in terms of what their views on racing are into the future as a product to bet on. And if any of them see it being a crucial part of their mix. So Dennis, if you're
Sure.
okay to start off.
So, we began sports betting live in 2018. And I guess one of the philosophies we had is how to cross-market sports betting and horse racing, and what type of opportunities for wagering can you offer. So we tried, in a small scale. We started with our Haskell race in 2018 and in 2019, and we offered fixed odds on those races. But we also offered other ways of cross-marketing. So, for example, you take a typical pick 4, pick 5, pick 6, and you offer a number of horse racing bets parlayed into a ball game. We found that was popular. Tried to get our markets, kind of mixed in terms of what their betting habits would be. So we found that a lot of horse players migrated over to sports betting, but we found a large number of sports bettors interested in trying some racing. So it grew our product, and then whether we liked it or not, during COVID and the pandemic, when everything else was shut down, we found that racing, which continued to offer an opportunity to wager, became very popular amongst the sports betting players. I mean, they were starved for bets to make, betting on things like Russian ping pong and Korean baseball and anything that moved. They were trying to bet on. But given the strength of horse racing, the way horse racing stayed operational, with or without fans, because Monmouth had about 4,000 fans a day live. But we found that people migrated to horse racing. Now the trick is, how do you keep them there? How do you keep them engaged? And I think you have to look at unique ways of cross-marketing sports to each other. in order to grow the business.
That makes sense. And John, you did touch on the partnership with PointsBet, who obviously offer horse racing in other markets. So if you could, just elaborate on those thoughts a little bit around how you intend on working with those guys in the future to generate some of those cross-sell opportunities.
Well, we have 3 sports books right now in Illinois that they're kind of running. So just getting off the ground, we just started in 2020 in September. So I know they're very interested in promoting horse racing. I know some of the people, right at the top own a bunch of horses in Australia. So, they love horse racing. We haven't gotten to the point of, hey, can we add horse racing to a sports bet? Our gaming board is, just getting, again, they've only been doing this for a year, so they're probably a little nervous about adding stuff to it. But I think, as Dennis said, when the pandemic hit, everybody's handle at horse racing kind of went up internationally. Of course, on site it didn't, but ours is still, we're probably up 20% over what it was pre-COVID. And I think it's because people did see this opportunity saying, oh, look at this, I can figure this out. They're all math people. And I think we have switched over some people permanently, but there's so many more that, when there's no sport that they want to bet on, why not bet on a horse race where you can, make some money easily, meaning 9-1. You don't have to, hope Baylor wins and you get negative 114. You have to bet 114 to get 100. So I'm thinking we will still draw those people in. And with PointsBet, I think we've got, meetings coming up during the next couple of months where we're going to talk about how do we cross-promote your stuff, our stuff, and make people feel like, hey, I'm going to come here and I'm going to have a good time. I mean, anecdotally, we had people here for March Madness, and there's the Florida Derby was going on, and we got a bunch of people betting on the Florida Derby. So when that race went off, there was probably half the people who had never bet a horse race before were, screaming for the race. So it just made it that much more exciting. So that's where we are with PointsBet. We're not too far, but we are going on the same path.
Sure. Yeah, and I think Dennis raised a great point at the start there that the pandemic exposed to many people in the racing industry how important distribution is. And ultimately, racing is a product that needs to get on the supermarket shelves of these facilitators of bets, be it an ADW or a fixed odds wagering operator. And obviously, throughout that period with limited content, it was front and center. And when there's not much else in the store, then naturally players are going to gravitate to that product. So the challenge is when that mix is full of sports and racing from all around the world, how can racing become a compelling offering that can get these guys betting on it into the future? So just on that point, I would like to expand a little bit with everyone around their views with international racing and the role it plays within the domestic US market. Obviously, if you're a sports fan and you go to a sports book and you went to Monmouth Park, or if you went to the Hawthorn racetrack, you could bet on soccer leagues from all around the world. You can bet on cricket, basketball, and it really becomes an agnostic position as to the content that's offered. And if you're a fan of a given vertical, there's no shortage of betting opportunities. Racing seems to be a little bit behind in this globally. I think that's one thing the Australian market's done a really good job of over the last 3 years in beefing out their offering and better serving that rusted on racing punter. For lack of a better term, I think there's a lot of racing players out there who are genuine fans of racing in general. And if there's a race somewhere in the world that they can't watch or can't bet on a given platform, I think it's a missed opportunity. And I think you guys as racetrack operators downstream, you lose that share of wallet to other sports if they're not able to stay on a given platform and keep betting on racing. So yeah, I'd love to get the views of everyone on international racing and any trends or opportunities they see in the market, starting with you, Dennis.
Sure, we've had extensive conversations with bet makers, which, I must say, you know, your company is terrific and they've been leaders in this space, and, they've been working very well with us in terms of trying to help us understand fixed odds as well as other opportunities that exist out there. So one of the things that I think we've, reached an agreement on is that we want to start offering a lot of fixed odds wagering on all the international races, because you're 100% right. Right now there are times when people are dying to bet on something. And if you bring that market here to the United States and offer it 24/7, there are races going on literally around the clock and opportunities to bet on fixed odds. One of the difficulties, with parimutuel wagering, although I certainly support parimutuel wagering and think it has its place in the future of our industry and will, remain steady. I think that one of the things you have to understand is that the complaints I get from the consumers that are at our racetrack is they don't get it when they bet on a horse and it goes into the gate and it's 2-1 and breaks out of the gate, goes a furlong, and that horse is now 3-5. And they think something's wrong, and they think that, they're not interested in that kind of bet. Fixed odds wagering opens the eyes of all those people to a different mentality when they make a wager on a horse race. So I think fixed odds, maybe not in year 1 and 2, is going to represent a giant percentage of our business, but I think 5 years from now, it could represent 50% of the total handle in the United States. Others may disagree with that estimate, but that's what I think, for what it's worth. And I think that as time goes on, you want to create opportunities not only for the international market, offering fixed odds around the clock when it exists, but even in our own marketplace. I think we learned during COVID that sometimes less is more. So when there are 20 tracks offering wagers, maybe the total handle on each track is not as great as if it's spread out over a period of time. So I think in marketing, you have to try and figure out where does your signal fit, in its best place throughout the industry to attract the most bets. I think that some people in the gaming industry, tell me based on their numbers, they say tennis represents 10% of the market that they're seeing in terms of handle. And there's no reason why horse racing in the future, handled properly, couldn't represent that same 10%, which would be a huge multiple growth of what we're currently doing.
Sure. And Ed, I guess you're uniquely positioned here, having worked in international racing positions. Obviously, the ADW overlaps watch and wager and the racetrack. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the international racing piece as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing, answering the original question, watchandwager.com, our DNA, our USP is international racing. So, we have the most content of any company in parimutuel across the world. So, we love international racing, and there's no sign that if you can offer more signals and more content, that it will affect your domestic, i.e. obviously domestic being the US. There's no sign of that. In fact, more is more is good. So, international's great, and the more content that we can provide, the better. I would say I'm beginning to disagree with Dennis on quite a few things. Just look at the margin. It's all about the margin. I know we're going to be talking about that on later in the webinar, but the margin is very, very important. And there's no proof that fixed odds will increase the margin, increase the turnover by 4 times, which is what you need, because you're going to be driving the margin down by about 4 times lower. So it's going to be very difficult to pay for itself. So, I'd be very cautious about that. And you only have to look at the UK and the Irish model and see where racing is at the moment. Brilliant racing, but low prize money. And we need to protect our horsemen, because fundamentally we don't have a product if the horses don't run around the track.
Sure, understood. John Walsh from Hawthorn, love to get your thoughts here before we move on to a little bit more around that very model you speak of, Ed.
I think international racing, we've always embraced it at our facilities and on our app because, you know, we're a melting pot. Being from Chicago, there's people from all over, and they love to bet Swedish racing when we had it. We have Hong Kong at night. We pretty much almost have a 24/7 product of racing. None of it's really fixed odds, because in Illinois, you'd have to change legislation to get that done. But I think people are aware of it. And, you know, every morning there's people betting South Africa and all through Illinois on all the ADW companies, and late at night, they're all betting Australia. So, you know, international is important, because, you know, the more you know, the more you bet on other countries, the more you realize racing is just not that little track in your backyard. It's really worldwide, and why not be a part of it?
Sure, and I think that's a really good point. And as we touched on earlier, like, I mean, from a US perspective, a lot of the domestic content does clash with, you know, the major sports, and therefore you are competing at a very tricky time to get the attention of the target audience. So if you can have that 24/7 ticker or something close to it in the background, that is the racing promotion wheel, so you've got a point of entry for these players. Ultimately, it will be a positive read through in terms of handle for the US racetracks. Just to expand on the fixed odds point that Dennis raised and also Ed there, obviously it would be remiss not to touch on the deal that Derby Development and BetMakers did do and announced last year. So Dennis, I'll start with you just in terms of what excited you most about the opportunity to roll out that new vertical of racing betting, and then we'll get into some of the economics and other questions after that.
Sure. I think what excited me most about the concept of fixed odds wagering is that as a racetrack operator, I needed to find ways of, you know, adding revenue to the operations in order to keep the purses at a competitive level with the surrounding region. At Monmouth Park, we don't have casinos, we don't have slot machines. We do get a small subsidy from the state, but not nearly the kind of money that the surrounding states are getting. So we started, you know, back in 2012, I guess, with the thought that we wanted to try sports betting, and we launched that challenge to PASPA. And although I never thought it would take as long as it did, I knew it wasn't going to get resolved at the district court level, would end up in the Supreme Court. Didn't think it would take till 2018, but you can't just sit on your laurels, so to speak. So once we incorporated sports betting into the facility and saw our revenues grow to a point where we could add money to the purses and keep our operations solvent, we started to think right away, okay, like what's next? What other opportunities do we want to offer? We experimented a little bit with exchange wagering several years ago. I think that was good for some reasons and bad for others. We weren't able to get content from some of the major racing jurisdictions, which was a little bit of a handicap that ultimately let Betfair, you know, get to a point where they wanted to stop on it at that point. Fixed odds wagering, though, you know, is exciting. I think that because of some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, that there's a huge opportunity for fixed odds to take a place in the betting markets in the United States. I do recognize that, you know, the pricing has to be right. And one of the concerns that we're going through right now in the industry, you know, both on a national and local level, is making sure that there's no cannibalization, you know, in terms of trying to see money leaving the tote and going over to fixed odds. Bet Makers has been very good in terms of providing us with studies of, experiments around the world showing statistics, showing that it really doesn't cannibalize. You're not eating into your exotic, handles. You're doing basically the win, play, show. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we wanted to offer consumers an opportunity to bet in a fixed odd venue. I think that one of the things that everybody needs to get a better understanding of when they look at the pricing is that the operator that's going to be offering these wagers has to be able to do so at a competitive level. So when they're considering whether they're going to promote and sponsor opportunities in horse racing, the numbers have to be close to other bets that they sell, because otherwise they're going to focus a lot of their money on the places where they make more money. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't have a magic wand. I can't tell you what the absolute correct pricing is, and that may change over the years. But I know if everybody sits stuck in the sand and says, we're not going to try this because we're concerned about the pricing, we're never going to advance. So somebody had to be first. Here in New Jersey at Monmouth Park, we've been leaders in trying to innovate. And I thought it was time to innovate with fixed odds wagering. And I'm excited about the prospect. We had a little delay because of COVID in moving forward in the right direction. But I'm hopeful that by the time Monmouth opens this year, that we'll be moving full steam ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and Ed touched on the UK model, which is obviously an established fixed odds market, where essentially with the very low taxation or product fees associated with the bets, the operators use it almost as a loss leader, or a product that's super low margin, high turnover, obviously. And Australia is probably a little bit more of a, I guess, from a racing front, where we're highly taxed. And that model of tote and fixed odds operating relatively harmoniously together has been going on for quite some time. So I think going forward, the pricing and the pricing structure really needs to be based off what we've observed in other markets that has worked and what we've observed in other markets that hasn't. Certainly, having access to exotic and larger payouts through tote pools, these are the products we need to be making available to the masses. And ultimately, in the US market, over the next 5 to 10 years, the masses is going to be reached through these fixed odds wagering operators with billion-dollar market caps and hundreds of $1 million in their marketing budgets. So racing needs to present a product that's appealing enough for those guys to spend their marketing dollars on, instead of an NCAA game or a soccer match or an NFL game. So it's a delicate balance, but certainly in a perfect world, that is the opportunity, and obviously with that comes new players. So John, I'll just get you to chime in on it as well. Obviously, you'll be in a twofold position around potentially having product from other racetracks in your venues, but also as a racetrack operator, I guess the economics and what you need to weigh up to see it as a compelling add-on. I guess any of your concerns or thoughts around that would be great.
I can see it as an add-on. I don't see it replacing. I think, like you said, the pools like the pick 3, pick 4, pick 6, the stuff that has value to it that you couldn't do fixed odds really with will draw customers. But then the fixed odds itself, it's a whole different group of people. I think your customers are totally different who are going to be doing that. They're going to be sports bettors. They're going to be guys who like a horse. They're going to be sharper people. But I still think it'll be an add-on to the regular pari-mutuel that we have now. So what the price is, I don't know. I agree with Dennis. We have to start somewhere, see what it is, work toward getting legislation passed, and then after it's done, say, all right, let's adjust. Or just like other experiments that don't work in racing, you just move on if it doesn't work out for the horsemen and the people putting on the show.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and ultimately it does need to get some real data before we can start to pivot and work out what the correct numbers are. Ed, I'll let you chime in. As I mentioned previously, you have a good understanding of the challenges the UK market's faced around quality racing not translating to quality returns to industry in Perth. So I'll let you touch on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think. No, thanks, Jake. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the UK, the issue fundamentally is that the way that the industry is funded is based on gross profits, not turnover. So there's the levy, which is a percentage of gross profits. Back in the day, it was used to be on turnover, i.e. handle, as we call it in the US. So you just wanted to handle as much. Now it's based on gross profits, which means that basically the racing industry doesn't want the favourites to win. You look at Cheltenham the week before last, you know, a lot of favourites won, and it means that racing actually makes less money, which is just terrible economics. So that is a problem. And, you know, I think, you know, what we're talking about is all about the price, you know. I think moving back to the US, and, you know, you will have, I'm sure all have noted the decision by Canada to unanimously prohibit fixed odds wagering on horse racing on March the 25th. And I really can't see Kentucky, California, and New York disagreeing with that, with all due respect to New Jersey.
Dennis, did you want to add anything to that before we move on to the next point?
I just think there are a lot of jurisdictions that are looking at it, including some of the jurisdictions just mentioned, and it remains to be seen what other states will do. So I think it's too early to predict what New York, Kentucky, California, and other major jurisdictions may do. I think they're all in the thought process, but I do agree. You know, when we tried exchange wagering, those jurisdictions were not willing to come on board with the pricing. So there may be challenges ahead, but I think that BetMakers is on top of talking to those jurisdictions to try and make it work. And on a national level, we're all talking. Can't say there's a consensus yet, but I'm hopeful that some of the major jurisdictions will come on board.
And ultimately, I guess the proof will be in the pudding, and that's obviously why we're so keen to get cracking and get some of that data so we can start to pivot that model to something that's optimal going forward for everyone. I'd like to finish off with something that ties in pretty well with the overall theme, and it's around what I'd say closing the generational gap. So the growth of the US regulated sports betting is obviously bringing about a lot of millennials and the 21 to 31 group who are potentially racing's next customer. The trend in the US, probably more so than other racing markets, certainly is around an aging customer base. So I'd like to know from everyone, obviously being close to that customer base at racetracks and tied to ADW turnover and handle, is there anything that springs to mind beyond what we've spoken about already that could help to close this gap for, I guess, the younger audience to try racing, and how we get them to stay with the sport longer term as well? So John, if you're there, I'll get you to start with this one.
We found a lot of young people enter our contests, and I'm sure Dennis will tell you the same thing. There's the group of poker players that we have that come to our contest. We just had a couple this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and one of them drove in from Iowa. He's at a poker tournament, came in, bet a few races, ended up winning the contest at our OTB that we had. I think contests and the chance to make money quickly, you know, without just sitting there all day. I think a lot of these guys like to, you know, play pick fours and pick fives because they, you know, see the value in it. And I think that's one thing that's going to get young people. I think Monmouth probably, they have a beautiful facility and we're updating our facility. I think that's another thing that will get some younger people betting on horse racing. In our contest, we had probably 107 people in it, and probably 40 of them were 35, 40 years old and younger. I know there's a couple kids who were just like 22, 23. They just got in. So I think that's one way. And I think just having a place that people can hang out and watch sports and watch races and enjoy themselves with their friends. That's what, you know, younger people want to do. That's what I want to do when I was younger. So that's how I think we get younger people.
Sure. And Ed Cummins, as an ADW operator, you'd obviously have access to some of this data around age of players and their trends. Is there anything you've seen that seems to be the way that segment is moving towards? And certainly, obviously, from a racetrack perspective, how do you get more millennials to a racetrack? And then, as John mentioned, participating in it could be a handicapping contest or some sort of early bridge to the sport, so they can have a chance to stay around longer term.
Yeah, Jake, you know, I've been in the industry 30 plus years and I love racing, but you can spend a lot of money chasing young people. Don't forget that, you know, there is an aging demographic. I mean, if you look at my boss, Jim Mellon's book, Juvenescence, which I strongly recommend anyone should read, the first baby has been born that's going to live to 150. So we have to get a balance there. There's a, you know, there's a pattern for horse racing punters where they get into it quite young, and then they get responsibilities. They have children, they've got houses, and then they come back to it late. So what's wrong with chasing the grey brand? Because the cost of acquisition for the young guys is very, very high. The one thing I would say also is in relation to the younger, the traders, and I think there's a huge market there. Not just people who go to the races, and we want as many young people at the races, but I think there's a huge market for algorithmic trading, day traders. I think COVID has shown us that people are spending their time at home. More and more people are not working necessarily 9 to 5, but they've got like multiple jobs and they're algo trading, stock markets, forex, etc. And why can't they do that on the horse racing model? So I think there's a good, and we're seeing a lot of growth in that area. So I think that's very positive for the sport.
Sure. And Dennis, I'll let you finish off on that. And then if there is any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box on the right of your screen, and we can spend the last few minutes going through those.
Sure. Yeah, I agree that, you know, our current bettors are an aging commodity. So the average age probably of someone at Monmouth Park, based on our numbers, is, you know, 66 years old. When we did exchange wagering, we found that the demographics were about 18 years younger than that. I think some of the more exciting things, you know, even though we had a small sampling of it, but the younger, you know, consumer like the in-race wagering, where they can continue to wager until the horses cross the finish line. And I think we do need to find a way to get the younger generation involved in horse racing. And one of the things, I know we're not talking about this today, but when you talk about the vision 5 years from now about being able to offer all types of wagers on one app and getting the younger eyes, you know, on your product, you got to think about esports too. You know, there's a huge growing market in esports that's all young, you know, and I think those are some of the players that if you can get to shift over to horse racing, they'll provide you benefits, in the years to come. So I think all in all, we do a lot of things at Monmouth Park to encourage young people. We have a huge picnic area. We have trying to encourage them to bring their families, face painting, bounce houses, pony rides. We try and cater to the younger generation, but at this point in time, the typical bettor is, getting older. And although they're going to continue to wager, we need to create opportunities for younger eyes and more eyes to look at our product and become enchanted with horse racing, because, it is a beautiful sport and a beautiful way to spend some time and wager. And, I can just see it in our picnic area. Of course, we're limited now because of COVID, because to the 4,000 people, but our picnic area probably holds about 21,000. And on a normal day, during the summer, it's filled with the younger generation that wants to come out and party and, engage in social, gaming with their friends. So whether they're betting on a horse race and everyone picking a different horse, or combining in some kind of contest, and I do agree the contests, provide a younger basis for our bettors. But I think we have to keep thinking of the younger generation and mixing in new experiences with what traditionally has been the race track mentality for attracting customers.
Understood. There's a few questions here that we'll just try and get through at the end. Ed Young's just asked if there's a replay will be available, and I'm told by Robin that there will be. The session is being recorded and will be circulated to the attendees. Jeff True, if you are listening, I've just pushed back a question to you to get some clarity around the question you just asked then. Oh, here we go. The question from Jeff was, would you do fixed odds racing without sports in a given state? So I presume he's referring to a state that has no intentions of rolling out a fixed odds sports betting product, and I guess how racing within that market could look to broaden its offering outside of pari-mutuel, and if it would be possible. And just to add on that as well, James King had a question around the New Jersey pilot program and whether this would become likely standard for approving fixed odds wagering in other states, which is probably a question that you could touch on at the start, Dennis. And then Ed and John on the, I guess, the front of racing as a standalone without a sports betting product next to it.
Sure. On the concept of offering fixed odds wagering in other states that have, for one reason or another, not yet enabled sports betting or don't intend to, I think long term, you're probably talking about 90% of the states offering sports betting. But in the interim, until they're up and running in different states, I do think fixed odds has its place at every racetrack in the country and every ADW. And it will be another add-on that will produce additional handle in that state. When we talk about, New Jersey and the pilot program, with all due respect, to our Attorney General and our Racing Commission, I don't like the pilot program. You have to understand the pilot program was the product of, I guess, bet makers and Monmouth Park started to look at legislation in New Jersey over a year ago, back in February of last year. And the first challenge that came around was a question for the Attorney General's office that, is it a sports bet or is it a horse bet? And there are major implications depending upon the answer to that question. So after waiting about 6 months, trying to get an opinion as to which it was, the governor's office was very supportive of fixed odds wagering, encouraged us to seek legislation, calling it a horse bet. In the interim, before the legislation got done, the Attorney General decided that they would do a pilot program where they authorize grade 1 races only. So one of the difficulties I have with the program is when you offer grade 1 races only in New Jersey till we get legislation passed, you're talking about less than 100 races a year that you can wager on. And with the Interstate Horse Racing Act, where you need the consent from the other states sending the signal in their racing commission, I think you're probably looking at states like Kentucky, Churchill Downs. I don't know, but I don't think they're going to, offer fixed odds on the Kentucky Derby this year. Breeders' Cup is trying to take a look at the pricing, what's the math? I don't know that New York is ready to offer Belmont and Saratoga. Probably some of the minor jurisdictions where they control the signals, they're willing to offer, but those probably don't have the grade 1 races. When we initially talked to the AG's office, the Racing Commission, at the regulatory meeting about at least doing grade 2 and grade 3 in addition to grade 1, they said it would have to go back to the AG. It would take too much time. So right now there's a pilot program that permits grade 1 races only. I'm sure there will be fixed odds wagering on the Haskell, and there may or may not be fixed odds wagering on the Hambletonian, which is the standardbred version of a grade 1, although the standardbred industry is not yet on board. I believe that they, as of my conversation with them this week, would prefer to see thoroughbred start, and they want to learn from the experience. They're not quite ready to hop on board yet. But I do think, all in all, you'll see a much different product than what the pilot program currently permits. And the pilot program, for what it's worth, does nothing to protect horse racing. The pilot program permits the take of our signal without paying horse racing a dime. So I'm certainly opposed to that position.
Thanks for the detailed response there, Dennis, because there was a few other questions that flowed through off the back of the original one that you covered off on, which was really good because we are out of time. An important time to note that the session has been recorded, and Robin and Steph will circulate everything with the attendees. Certainly, if there is any other questions from anyone, feel free to shoot through an email. I'm Jake at betmakers.com. Would love to chat to anyone about racing globally, specifically any opinions around the topics we covered today. And most importantly, hopefully we could catch up with everyone in the same room at some stage in the near future. And obviously there's a lot of great horse racing people who have tuned in. And I think ultimately everyone has the same goal, and that's to grow the sport and to leave it in a better place than what it currently is. And yeah, thank you for everyone for coming and tuning in, and thank you to our panelists for their contributions.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you, Jake. Good job.